Hello, this is a supplemental video for English 100 at UBC. My name is Kevin McNeilly, and I'm going to pick up a little bit where we left off in our discussion of Yeats, partly because we didn't get too far into the Lake Isle of Innisfree, reading it and interpreting it. Remember that I said, and I want you to think about this a bit critically to decide if you think this is true or not, that the poem seems to work between the modes of description and production, is what I called it. Production has, thinking about production or sort of creative, the creative event, the idea of a kind of making, some kind of fabrication that happens in a poem, goes back to the thinking of Aristotle. And Aristotle's word for, in ancient Greek, I guess, for production is poiesis. The idea of making or creating is at the root, and we've been talking about etymology quite a bit. It's at the root of the word and really the concept of poetry. So, in this sense, poetry stands in for any kind of making or creation or production, when you assemble something, when you put it together. This is quite literally a poem, The Lake Isle of Innisfree. It's an early poem by Yeats. He would be in his mid-20s when he produces this text, and he's kind of taking part in what must seem like a fairly nostalgic literary moment in Irish literature and English, which is involves the creation of poetry and other works by a group of artists who kind of named themselves the Celtic as belonging to the Celtic Twilight, and you'll notice that a kind of twilight sky and the color purple enter into this poem, and these are hallmarks of this kind of literary movement, which concerns itself with folk forms, so folk song, mythology, that kind of thing, stories. And we'll see Yeats takes up this kind of material throughout his work, so it's not just that it happens here. And also with addressing that material in a kind of nostalgic mode. So nostalgia, with one more kind of etymological take on things, comes from a Greek word that's used in the Odyssey, Homer's Odyssey. So this is a place to locate this idea, nostos, which means the homeward journey, going home in a certain sense. And we've been talking about home in class. So nostos, and the algia part is sickness. Nostalgia is homesickness. And Yeats is articulating a kind of homesickness here. I asked us to think about rhythm. Got my book, so we're going to just chat about this for a minute or two. If we read it aloud in class, and in contrast to Gwendolyn Brooks' poem, you can hear a lot more space in this text, I think. So he says, I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, a hive for the honey bee, and live alone in the bee-loud glade. One of the things we noticed as we were leaving class, as we were ending things, was that the fourth line of each of the 3 stanzas seems to shift a bit rhythmically. Here's the next chorus, and I shall have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the vales of the morning to where the cricket sings. There, midnight's all a glimmer, and noon a purple glow. There's that purple of the Celtic twilight. And evening full of the linnet's wings. I don't know how good my reading is, maybe not great, but something to notice is built into the repetition that's quite literally in the poem itself. So we have dropping, dropping, peace, peace. You'll see that go now, the line, I will arise and go now, or the half line, that's called a hemistick, a half line. The half line that begins the poem is repeated at the beginning of the last stanza as well. And there's repetition inside. Go now and go, and. There's this kind of cumulative movement in the poem, built on conjunctions, built on a kind of additive principle, or this, and this is called parataxis, adding things in series in a way, or one thing adding to another or accreting to another. This is part of this rhythmic structure here. Um, if you want to think a little bit about the idea of a folk form, um, if you just sort of hear the pulse beat behind the lines, because it's fairly consistent, you have this a feel of something like that goes da na da na da na na da na 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 ba na ba na ba na, just nonsense syllables in there. And this shifts in the last line of each stanza. You have something that goes ba na ba na ba na ba na. So that if you just listen to the banas, however you want to think about it, you have 6 principal beats, or maybe with a bit of a kind of added syllable. So we could say even 7 principal beats in the longer lines, and then it shifts to 4 in the shorter lines at the end of the stanza. And this is echoing a kind of ballad-like or folk song form. If you open up any Christian hymnal, or if you look to folk ballads, there's often an alternating 4-beat, 3-beat stanza. One of the ways to hear this, I don't know if it's a bit light, but if you know the opening theme to Gilligan's Island, or that piece on 60s television uses this kind of form. Ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. So Yeats has taken up a form that has a kind of folksy depth to it. It goes back historically quite far, and he's adapted it a little bit. Notice also that at the end of the first hemistick in each of the lines, the first half line, you get what we characterized in class as a kind of a spondee, or a clustering of 2 stresses, or more than 2 sometimes. Excuse me. So I will arise and go now. There's some kind of insistence that happens, some kind of weighting around the idea of a present. I'm just going to do it, whatever he's going to do it now, and he's going to do it there as well, right? Build there. We'll find some peace there. You can hear that insistence on place and on a kind of contemporaneity. He's drawing a past into his present. Remember that he casts himself as standing, and notice again that the tense is the verb tense is in the present. While I stand on the roadway or on the pavement's gray. He's sort of been arrested, standing in some kind of urban setting, by a vision of his past, his boyhood, and visiting this small island on a lake near his home in Sligo, in Ireland. If you think about this idea of production, it's characterized in this poem as imaginative building, or even a kind of cultivation or gardening. He's going to plant beans, he's going to collect honey, or he's going to build a small cabin. So that's poiesis, at least in the descriptive aspect of this poem, that it's describing the activity in his imagination, because he doesn't actually do this. But he's imagining this kind of return and of creating something. So poiesis, making, is projected into the future in this text. It has a kind of utopian aspect, this sense of being no place yet, utopian, of a kind of ideal contrivance. But at the same time, the poem is he says, I will arise, so that future is there, or I shall do this. I will arise. It's projected into that future. And yet, as I was just pointing out, much of the poem is in the present. So it's involved in mapping, not just describing, but in kind of mapping that nostalgia, in mapping that urge to produce or to create. The now of the poem, not just its writing, but actually, I think for us, it's reading. And this is where the rhythm comes in I think, quite significantly, is that in rhythmatizing his work and in echoing these folk forms, I think it's useful to think about this poem as a kind of incantation, as a kind of magic spell. Yeats is projecting toward a future, but trying to draw that future into the present in the rhythmic outlay of the words themselves. So it's important what they say, but in fact, what we're hearing principally is this badum, badum, this kind of repeated wave-like chorus. Notice there are waves lapping on the shore here. Light is glimmering, so everything is in this kind of pulse beat. And that's, in fact, what he's hearing. If you want to think of the embodied nature of how we might read this poem, he hears the end of the poem. As the rhythm shifts as well, he hears this recurrent pulse beat, he says, in the deep heart's core. That's a bit of a cliche. It would have been a cliche in Yeats's time to evoke this idea of the heart. But in a physiological sense, you've been hearing a kind of pulse beat. You've been hearing the heart's rhythm as his body attunes itself, I think, to this, this nostalgia, this return. One last point, too. There's lots to say about this poem, but I'm going to leave it here. One last point is to think about that rhythmic shift. That is to say, although there's a kind of mesmeric, a kind of mesmerizing quality, sort of hypnotic quality to the recitation of this piece, as he produces this sense of I, of, we say, of a speaking subject, of I will arise and go now. And we, as listeners, think of the we in Gwendolyn Brooks's We Real Cool. There's a kind of empathetic opening of that subjectivity, of that speaking I, to us as readers, as we sort of recite this poem, maybe even in our mind's ear, in our heart's core, if you want to think of it that way, along with him, and as our pulse gets attuned to it. So we start to be taken in by that beat. Da-da, na-na, na-na, ba-na, na-na, na-na. It's supposed to be hypnotizing in a certain sense, like a spell or like an incantation. But the last line of the stanzas, as we've been pointing out, shifts it up. Da-da-da-da-da-da. It becomes a little more iambic, a little clipped, and the number of beats is, although it's implied in the folk form here, gets extended. So at the same time as we're being hypnotized, that hypnosis kind of gets disrupted at the end. There's a self-awareness or a reflexivity. You kind of wake up and say, wait a minute, from that spell. The spell both enchants you, supposedly, and breaks the spell at the same time. So homesickness seems to involve here this imaginative return, the creation, the production of a feel of going there, of being transported, and also the disruption of that feel. I wanted to talk just briefly, too, in contrast to this poem, about Easter 1916, which also uses a certain idea of what we might characterize as a public poetry, but does it in a rather different way. It's a poem that's written later in Yeats's life, when he's in his late 50s, and there's political upheaval happening in his country. So if in the Lake Isle of Innisfree he's returning nostalgically, kind of sweetly, to the landscape of Ireland, coming home in his mind at least, in Easter 1916, the possibility of that return is much more thoroughly disrupted, and we're not quite allowed to settle in the same way. So some of this light disruption that's happening in the Lake Isle of Innisfree is being refused in Easter 1916. It's also important to notice the contrast between the public and private modalities, I guess we could say, of these two poems. The Lake Isle of Innisfree is a poem of escape and of departure and of a retreat into the personal. He'll be alone. He's got a small cabin. He's withdrawn from the world back into his landscape. In Easter 1916, the world is very much with him and tends to disallow and to disturb the possibility of any kind of private return, the lyric mode, in other words, which is so thoroughly present in the Lake Isle of Innisfree, is almost lost in Easter 1916. So it's important, the poem is dated, it's 1916, and this date refers to the Easter Rising in Dublin and in Ireland more broadly, principally in Dublin. So this is a significant date in the foundation of Ireland and it's as a country, and of the Irish Free State. Um, uh, Remember, at this point, prior to 1916 and beyond it somewhat, Ireland is an English colony. The English are governing here. And over Easter weekend in 1916, there's a violent uprising, an attempt to foment revolution and to create the Irish state. The Irish are defeated. The Irish rebels, it's an early version of the IRA, it's called the Irish Republican Brotherhood. They're defeated. These figures are named late in the poem, so you can MacDonagh and McBride and Connolly and Pearse. So Yeats is very interested in, this is maybe parallel to the United States in some way, although 150 years later, he's interested in the ways in which a sense of national belonging, a sense of country, of nationhood, can emerge out of revolutionary transformation. Invoking those names at the end of the poem is a way of, in a very different context, calling up a certain kind of nostalgia, although it's a kind of a blighted homesickness, as you'll see. The poem begins, I have met them at close of day, coming with vivid faces, from counter or desk among gray 18th century houses. Whoever they, I guess the common people, the public. Yeats characterizes himself late in his career as, well, this is from another poem, Among School Children. He says he's a 60-year-old smiling public man. That's because he becomes a senator in the early Irish Republic. He actually has a political job later in his life. Um, just a little later after this poem, a little after this poem is written. Uh, that public function, though, he's in the later among school children, which is a little later than this poem. He's in his composition. He's visiting a school as a kind of public official, but he's producing a kind of writing that sort of sits between the lyric privacy, the lyric intimacy, the loneliness in a way, or the aloneness of the I in the Lake Isle of Innisfree, and another I here. This poem begins, I have met them. So that I is still present, but those whom he's meeting are a public who aren't happy, who aren't sort of projecting toward a kind of future. In some ways, the future is enacted here. It's called up, but instead of it being this sweet, honey-laden, nostalgic sense of place and of belonging, you have polite, meaningless words, nods of the head, and a sense of being, he says, they and I but lived, only lived where motley is worn. That's the garment of the fool. So there's a sense of being kind of broken, ironic, meaningless, at least in terms of language and of how we speak to each other and of how we produce communities, of things being dysfunctional and uncertain. All, he says, all of them, all of us, all of the world, all changed, changed utterly. And this is the chorus in here. If we had that kind of repetitive, mesmerizing chorus in the Lake Isle of Innisfree, here we have a terrible beauty is born. So instead of this kind of sweet beauty, there's an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms that the poem evokes. A terrible beauty is born. Notice how the lines, if we think of them rhythmically here, are much more dense. There's much less of that kind of trippingness that you heard in the Lake Isle of Innisfree. And if this is a spell, if it's in its course like structure is trying to evoke a particular kind of feeling, the socius, the public aspect of that feeling, it involves a kind of contradiction in terms, an oxymoron here, where beauty can only be terrible, can only be disruptive, can only be unhappy in a certain sense. Transformation here is not transcendental, but in a certain sense, decreative. The world is being pulled apart. This poem is published in a volume in 1921. You can see this if you have your Yeats reader and you look at the title on the page. In terms of Ireland's political history, remember again, Yeats is going to become a senator, so he's going to participate, at least in a kind of structural way, in the Irish polity. This is before the establishment of the current Irish Free State, and so you have a kind of revolutionary republic happening. So the Easter 1916 is a failure in terms of self-governance, but over the course of the next 5 years or so, the republic actually, the Irish people actually do manage to throw off English influence, and the civil war that takes place in those years is set in motion by this failed rebellion in Easter 1916. So it becomes a kind of terrible and, I suppose in a certain sense, in a kind of larger sense, ironically, foundational moment in the country's history. The nation comes out of a kind of broken rebellion. And because it's in this kind of in-between state, politically and I guess we could say existentially, who you are as a person, this I or this public that he keeps evoking, kind of sadly, a bit bereft of meaning, uncertain. Because he's written the poem, he's dated the poem September 25th, 1916, so there's some doubt as to what's going to go on. As I said, the poem is published in 1921 too, at least in this volume, so you have it emerging throughout this time of civil war. He says in the poem, "For England may keep faith for all that is done and said." That's kind of an anti-revolutionary sentiment, kind of a despairing sentiment, that things have failed. Should we just go back to living under colonial masters and just let go and have some. The word faith there might be something to cotton onto, that this is a kind of a bitter faith, if it's faith at all. He seems to have, at that moment at least in the poem, to indicate a kind of loss of faith. The poem ends with him, I mentioned already, evoking the names, the proper names. This is Innisfree is the proper name of a space. McDonough and McBride and Connolly and Peirce are the proper names of those revolutionaries. And dead revolutionaries, either executed or killed in the rebellion. Notice that what he does in the poem's present tense is actually be reflexive again. He says, "I write it out in a verse." So there's something about writing that memorializes or gives monumental value, stabilizes what feels like that kind of terrible, uncertain sense of a future. So, although the birth that's taking place in the poem is a difficult one, nonetheless, the poem itself seems to give birth to advocate for a particular kind of national belonging, despite its doubts, despite its the harsh form of the lines, these kind of clipped 8-syllable lines that have a kind of 3-beat structure to them, that seem to be quite blunted and difficult themselves. Despite that sense of difficulty, you have some kind of faith, some sense of an alternative beauty wanting to articulate itself, no matter how terrible that might seem. So think about that contrast between these two poems and how they both inhabit this tension between the public and the private, between withdrawal and advocacy, the ephemeral and the monumental, and try to negotiate with some sense of being a speaking subject of what it is that words do as you pronounce them.